Greetings, YouTube. Let me turn my light. The other day, I saw a video, and the person was talking about photography, and which they're going to school for, to become a professional photographer. And she in particular was interested in doing photography of commercial furnishings, because the whole idea of setting up the scenes and the lighting and the composition was something that fascinates her. I can respect that. And I've spoken about my Uncle George in the past, but it occurred to me as I'm listening to this, and I mentioned it in a comment to her, that George was a fascinating character. In fact, now that I thought about it as I wrote the comment on her channel, I realized that if you were to create a character, if I were to write a character for a role-playing game or for a short story, for a film, based on my uncle, it would sound absurd. That his real life you'd look at this character going, no one's like this in real life. This is just too weird. This is too many things crammed all into one character. And that was George. I mentioned that he was a part-time professional photographer, and that kind of pretty much sums up George's entire life. He was a part-time professional, lots of things. He was, in fact, a part-time professional photographer. He did weddings and things like that. He only did, he didn't do formalized things. He did very dynamic things where he would move around the wedding party and take candid shots. He had a really wonderful eye. He did quite a bit of things on racing. Particularly, he liked doing drag racing and dirt track racing, and these things ended up in magazines and such. He liked doing for his particular personal work. He did a lot of black and white things. He had a thing for compositions with car parts. But he did also do some wonderful photography of the cats that his mother had over the years and family members. There's a really great picture of my sister that he did when she was a baby that was just maybe my favorite picture of my sister of her entire life. And if he'd just been that kind of a photographer, he would be an interesting character. I mean, he did it all. He had his own developing stuff in the basement. He wanted complete control of the entire process. In fact, he had one lens for his camera. This is back in, of course, film and stuff. And it was like 18 inches long. Telephoto lens. It was ginormous. But George wasn't just a photographer. He was a private investigator with an actual private investigator's license and a license to carry a concealed firearm. And while he did that as a part-time job, he didn't hunt people down in a Mickey Spillane kind of thing. He used those big-ass telephoto lenses of his to take incriminating evidence about people. And he would camp out in his car for days if he had to. And take pictures from, a block, 2 blocks away. So there was no way that people would know that there was someone taking pictures of them as they were having their clandestine meetings, which then he would then hand as evidence over to the annoyed spouse, and they would very shortly after that get a divorce. And that's the kind of thing that he did, but he carried a firearm and blunt weapons in the car just in case. And George was a fairly large, imposing man. And he was just never going to be all that carefree with it. Because part of him was a redneck. And he just liked his guns. Because he liked to hunt. A lot. And while he loved to hunt, he was not into hunting for the purposes of just killing. He was into hunting for the purposes of acquiring food. He may have loved the hunt, but he ate everything he hunted. In fact, he went to one shoot once where they were actually shooting birds just as targets, and he was disgusted and left. He got to go hunting bear up really far north in like an Indian reservation because he was invited there shortly before he died, and he had Hodgkin's disease, and he died at 29. And he got a chance to do that kind of thing, and it was great. He went buffalo hunting with a pistol. George was serious when it came to hunting. And again, photographer, private investigator, Loved his guns. But he also owned a garage. Or half a garage. B&G Off-Road, Barry and George. Those are the two people that ran the garage. And he loved that gig. And they would convert vehicles into off-road stuff. And again, he lived in Pennsylvania. There was a lot of off-roading stuff. And they would do a lot of... In fact, they had a Cadillac out front, which they had converted into an off-road vehicle to show that they could convert anything into an off-road vehicle. And they are also somewhat involved in some of like the mud races, where people would... they would help lay out the courses and stuff. And again, it was a way to show off their work and to drum up more business. And George built his own car. He had a Chevy Vega. And he bought the Chevy Vega at a police auction. And he brought it to the garage. And he took the body off the Chevy Vega. And he threw the car away. And then he built himself a custom tubular steel frame that he welded himself with integral fire extinguishing system, like a professional race car. And they had 5-point harness bucket seats in the front for he and his passenger. The back seat was a standard back seat. And he had a real leather roof on it. And he had 40 layers of red hand-lacquered paint on that car. It gleamed. The paint was so deep, it was like you could fall into it. And it would have had a top speed of like 170 miles an hour. I know I was in it once at 130 on the highway, which is illegal, but very cool. And again, if that was just the things that George had done, that would be enough of a character. But that wasn't the limit of George's character. He was a redneck, and his buddies were rednecks. And his buddies were interesting. One of his buddies lived with a mountain lion. He had slaughtered a deer, and he'd gutted it outside, and he came outside, and there's a mountain lion eating the remains. And he freaks out and walks into his house, and he left the door open, the porch door, and the mountain lion came in and stayed. And he just ignored the mountain lion, and the mountain lion ignored him. Rednecks like this are just amazing. He had a buddy that had a pet fox. I mean, these guys were just crazy. He had a buddy who had a license to fly in a small plane. And one day, his buddy got a job to go pick up a body. It didn't occur to him when he was to pick up a body that since he had a small plane, it was a 4-passenger plane, they weren't going to get a coffin on that thing. So they had to put the body in the back seat and 2 cases of beer in the other, and they drank all the way back because they had a body in the back of the plane. Very dangerous, very stupid, but very funny. George was a character. And he had such a laugh. And his face would light up. It was like Santa Claus. And if George was still alive, he'd be 60 now. And if the cancer hadn't taken him, he would have married his girlfriend Mary. And they would have had kids, and I would have been sort of an uncle to my nieces and nephews, because frankly, I would have been 20-something years older than them. It's weird to think that George would have been 60 now. And the day he died, rather the day we buried him, I was one of the pallbearers. And my mom's car blew a tire at the church. So we're out back behind the church, he and me and the other guys, changing the tire, and we're laughing because, this is what George did for a living. Took care of cars, took care of trucks. And as we're changing the tire, laughing about the fact that we're changing the tire at George's funeral, a V of geese flew overhead. And we knew that George was there. George was a character. And if you were to write up George, he would sound absurd. And I love George. And I miss George. And I like to think that in a very, very small way, part of George lives on in me. In his eclectic desire to collect things. He collected watches and camera bits and you name it. Guns and knives. He collected car parts and always had a project going. He promised my sister to build her a Bradley GT, but no. He didn't get to do that. And he was a procrastinator when it came to half the things in his life. He took me out when I was 12 and I got to shoot a Castle 454. And I got to help drive a Woody, big wood paneled station wagon when I was 5. Or 6. He's 6 because he was 16 when he got his license. He was 10 years old. I love George. I miss George. I pray to my gods that more than the beard is like George, that maybe a little bit of him lives on.